"This is our maid," Thomas Harper said with a pleasant smile, gesturing toward his own daughter as if he were introducing a seasonal centerpiece instead of Evelyn Harper, age 67, who had just driven 42 miles in light November traffic to sit at that table. The words floated across the Thanksgiving dining room in a tone so casual that for a moment no one questioned them. A few guests chuckled politely. Silverware clinked against china. The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon sweet potatoes lingered in the air. Evelyn did not correct him. She adjusted the cuff of her navy blazer, the one tailored on Madison Avenue 15 years ago when she signed her first executive contract, and she smiled as though she had misheard. Linda Harper, seated at the head of the table beneath the brass chandelier, added lightly, "She's always been such a help around the house." The room hummed with soft laughter again, the kind that slides across polished hardwood floors without leaving a mark. Evelyn folded her hands in her lap. She had brought a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet and a pumpkin pie made from her grandmother's recipe, the crust pressed carefully at dawn in her quiet condominium kitchen overlooking the Long Island Sound. She had believed this invitation meant something different this year. After all, Thanksgiving was supposed to be about gratitude, about acknowledging the people who built the table long before it was decorated. She watched as her father carved the turkey with deliberate pride, recounting stories from decades past. Stories in which Evelyn was rarely the hero and often the cautionary tale. "Never married," he said with a half shrug to a couple visiting from Boston. "Too busy working." No one asked what kind of work required such devotion. No one, except for one man seated 3 chairs down, a tall gentleman with silver hair and steady eyes named Daniel Brooks. He did not laugh. He did not sip his drink at the right moment. He studied Evelyn with recognition, not confusion. The chandelier light caught the thin gold watch at her wrist, a quiet symbol of the years she had invested building something no one at this table had bothered to understand. Evelyn kept her posture straight. She passed the cranberry sauce when requested. She thanked her mother for the green beans. She did not defend herself, because humiliation, she had learned over 6 decades, did not always arrive with raised voices. Sometimes it came wrapped in linen napkins and carved turkey, disguised as humor. Across the table, Daniel cleared his throat softly, and in that small pause before anyone else could speak, the air shifted just slightly, as if the room itself were reconsidering the story it had just been told. Daniel Brooks set his fork down with deliberate calm, as though he were preparing to comment on the weather rather than the quiet distortion that had just passed as family humor. He looked directly at Evelyn, not at Thomas, not at Linda, but at her, and asked in a measured voice what her current position was these days. The question hung in the air like a glass ornament about to fall. Thomas laughed lightly and waved a dismissive hand, saying she handled accounts and paperwork, nothing too exciting, just numbers. Evelyn reached for her water glass and took a slow sip. The coolness steadied her breathing. She did not rush to fill the silence. For decades, she had learned that the truth did not require volume. It required timing. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, then said that Brooks Medical Systems had recently expanded into 3 additional states and credited the strategic planning of their chief financial officer for guiding the company through a volatile market without layoffs or debt restructuring. A faint crease formed between Linda's brows. One of the guests from Boston shifted in his chair and glanced from Daniel to Evelyn as if recalculating a balance sheet in his mind. Daniel continued in the same even tone, explaining that their chief financial officer had negotiated multi-million-dollar supplier contracts and stabilized operating margins during a period when many companies were downsizing. He paused then, not for effect, but because the statement was complete. The only missing piece was recognition. Evelyn set her glass down gently and met Daniel's gaze. She did not nod. She did not confirm. The truth did not need endorsement. Around the table, forks slowed. Thomas cleared his throat and reached for the gravy boat, pouring more than necessary over his plate as though the excess could soften the moment. Linda forced a bright smile and asked who wanted more sweet potatoes. The question sounded rehearsed. One of the younger guests whispered that he had read about Brooks Medical Systems in a business journal the previous spring. Another asked if they were the company that had invested in rural clinics across the Midwest. Daniel answered yes, they were, and added that the chief financial officer had insisted on that expansion because access to health care should not depend on a zip code. Evelyn felt the room tilt in a subtle way, not physically but socially, like a compass needle adjusting to a stronger magnetic field. The title that had been withheld at this table for years now rested plainly between the serving dishes and folded napkins. She did not look at her parents. She studied the flicker of candlelight against the polished silver and listened to the careful quiet that followed. For the first time that evening, no one laughed. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, like fog lifting off the shoreline outside Evelyn's condominium on early winter mornings. Someone cleared his throat. A fork scraped lightly against porcelain. Thomas finally looked at his daughter, really looked at her, as if seeing the outline of something that had always been there, but never acknowledged. Linda's smile held, but it no longer reached her eyes. She adjusted the pearl necklace at her collarbone and commented that it must be nice to stay busy after retirement age. Evelyn did not correct the assumption. She let it rest on the table like an unopened letter. Daniel answered instead, explaining that Evelyn had not retired and that in fact, she had overseen the company's largest acquisition just last quarter, a transaction that required months of negotiation and precise financial forecasting. The guest from Boston leaned forward with new interest and asked how she had anticipated the supply chain disruptions that affected so many competitors. Evelyn placed her napkin beside her plate and spoke for the first time that evening about her work, her voice steady and measured, describing how data patterns revealed weaknesses long before headlines did, how responsible leadership meant planning 5 years ahead rather than reacting 5 days too late. She did not boast. She explained. The table listened. Even the clink of ice and water glasses seemed to quiet. Thomas shifted in his chair and mentioned that she had always been good with numbers as a child, balancing her allowance in a small notebook. The memory sounded smaller than it once had. Linda added that Evelyn used to organize the pantry alphabetically, as if discipline were a charming quirk rather than a skill that had built an empire. Evelyn heard the reframing and understood it for what it was, a way to shrink achievement into personality. She did not challenge them. She described the rural clinics the company had funded across the Midwest, the towns under 20,000 residents where access to basic care had once required a 2-hour drive. She spoke of spreadsheets and community impact in the same sentence, because to her, they had never been separate. One of the younger guests asked what had inspired that initiative. Evelyn paused only briefly before answering that growing up in a house where image mattered more than truth had taught her that real value was measured quietly, not announced at dinner. The words were not sharp. They were clear. Across from her, Daniel gave a subtle nod, not as an endorsement, but as recognition. The candles had burned lower now, wax pooling softly at their bases. Outside, November wind brushed against the windows. Inside, the story had changed. Not because Evelyn demanded it to change, but because she allowed the facts to occupy the space that false introductions once filled. Coffee was served with the pie, and the rhythm of the evening tried to return to something familiar, but familiarity had shifted its shape. Linda asked if anyone wanted whipped cream, her voice overly bright, as though sweetness could reset the room. Thomas spoke about property taxes in Connecticut and how they seemed to rise every year, a safe topic, measurable in percentages and annual statements. Evelyn listened without interrupting. She had spent her life translating numbers into meaning. She understood deflection when she heard it. The younger guests now addressed her directly, asking about market trends, about leadership, about how a company maintained stability when others faltered. She answered in the same even tone she used in board meetings, clear and unhurried, explaining that stability came from discipline, from saying no to short-term applause in favor of long-term strength. Daniel added quietly that integrity in financial leadership was rare and that he trusted hers without hesitation. The words did not sound exaggerated. They sounded earned. Thomas shifted again, this time folding his napkin with careful precision, the crease aligned perfectly with the table edge. He remarked that success often required sacrifice, glancing at Evelyn as if to suggest that her career had cost her something essential. Evelyn met his gaze calmly and replied that every choice required sacrifice, including the choice to remain small so others could feel tall. The statement landed without sharpness. It was not accusation. It was observation. Linda's hand paused over the coffee pot. For a moment no one moved. Outside, headlights passed along the quiet suburban street. illuminating the dining room windows in brief sweeps of white. Inside, the candles had burned nearly to their bases, wax forming small, hardened pools around the holders. Evelyn thought about the first apartment she had rented at 22, barely 600 square feet, where she had studied financial reports at a folding table while her parents told relatives she was still trying to figure things out. She thought about the years she had driven 2 hours each way to meetings in Manhattan, about the winters when snow piled 12 inches high along the curb and she left before sunrise anyway. She had never asked for applause. She had asked only for accuracy. Across the table, Daniel asked whether Brooks Medical Systems would consider expanding their community health initiative into New England. Evelyn explained that they were reviewing data from several counties and that access gaps remained significant. Her voice did not waver. She was not performing. She was being precise. Thomas finally spoke her full name, not as a correction, but as a recognition. Evelyn Harper. The sound of it felt different in the room now. Not diminished. Not softened. Simply true. She lifted her coffee cup, inhaled the warmth, and realized that respect, when it arrived, did not thunder. It settled quietly, like snow, covering what had once been exposed, and leaving the landscape unmistakably changed. Dessert plates were cleared slowly, as though no one wanted to be the first to disturb what had settled over the room. The earlier laughter had not returned. It had been replaced by something quieter and more careful. Linda gathered the empty serving dishes with deliberate efficiency, the way she always did when she wished to regain control of an atmosphere. Thomas stood and offered to refill coffee cups, moving from chair to chair with measured politeness. Evelyn remained seated for a moment, observing the choreography. She had watched similar performances in corporate boardrooms when a failed strategy was repackaged as a temporary adjustment. The language changed. The facts did not. Daniel rose and offered to help carry plates into the kitchen. In that narrow space beneath bright recessed lights, Linda attempted light conversation about holiday travel plans, about how unpredictable winter weather could be in New England. Daniel responded courteously but did not dilute what had been acknowledged at the table. He mentioned again how fortunate Brooks Medical Systems felt to have Evelyn's leadership, how stability at the executive level created confidence for employees whose mortgages and college tuition payments depended on steady decisions. Linda nodded, her reflection faint in the stainless steel refrigerator door, and remarked that it was impressive, truly impressive, though she had always known her daughter was capable. The statement sounded newly polished. Back in the dining room, Thomas approached Evelyn with 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of her without speaking. She thanked him. The word was simple and neutral. He remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, then sat down across from her. He commented that managing such responsibility must be exhausting, that perhaps it was time she considered easing into something less demanding. Evelyn looked at the steam rising from her cup before answering. She said that responsibility was not exhausting when it aligned with purpose. What was exhausting was pretending to be smaller than one truly was. The sentence did not carry heat. It carried weight. Thomas leaned back slightly, absorbing it. Around them, guests began to gather coats from the hallway rack, scarves draped over arms, polite goodbyes exchanged near the front door. The evening was ending, but its balance had shifted in a way that would not reverse. One of the younger guests paused beside Evelyn and asked for her advice about pursuing a career in finance. She offered a concise response about discipline, about integrity, about choosing mentors who valued truth over comfort. When the front door finally closed behind the last guest, the house felt larger, almost echoing. Linda returned to the dining room and looked at her daughter without performance for the first time that evening. There was no apology in her expression yet, but there was awareness. Evelyn stood, gathered her coat from the back of her chair, and smoothed the fabric over her shoulders. She did not wait for correction. She did not request acknowledgment. She simply carried herself toward the door with the steady composure of someone who no longer needed permission to be accurately named. Cold air met Evelyn's face as she stepped onto the front porch, the November night carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke. The sky above Connecticut was clear, a dark stretch of quiet stars that had nothing to prove to anyone below. She paused for a moment before descending the 3 wooden steps, adjusting her gloves with steady hands. Inside the house, she could still hear the muted clatter of dishes being stacked, the the low murmur of her parents' voices blending into something indistinct. For years, she had left this house carrying the same invisible weight, a sense that no matter how far she drove or how much she achieved, she would return to a version of herself edited for their comfort. Tonight felt different. Not dramatic, not explosive, simply clarified. Her car sat beneath the bare branches of the maple tree at the edge of the driveway. She unlocked it and settled into the driver's seat, the leather cool against her back. For a moment, she did not start the engine. She let the quiet surround her, the dashboard lights glowing softly against the dark interior. She thought about the narrow dining room table she had grown up around, about the expectations pressed into her long before she understood them. Do not outshine. Do not challenge. Do not make others uncomfortable with your ambition. Those instructions had been delivered gently over decades, wrapped in concern and family humor. She had followed them once. She had learned to shrink her vocabulary at gatherings, to simplify her stories, to describe multi-million-dollar negotiations as paperwork. Tonight, she had not argued. She had not defended. She had simply allowed truth to remain in the room. That was enough. Her phone vibrated softly in her coat pocket. A message from Daniel appeared on the screen. He thanked her for her leadership and for the clarity she brought to every conversation, whether in a boardroom or at a dining table. He added that integrity did not need introduction. Evelyn read the words once, then again, not for reassurance, but for recognition. She placed the phone back into her pocket and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the driveway in a clean arc of white light. As she reversed and guided the car toward the quiet suburban street, she felt no surge of anger, no dramatic swell of triumph. Instead, she felt alignment. The kind that comes when the story told about you no longer defines you. In her rearview mirror, the house grew smaller, its windows glowing warmly against the dark. It looked unchanged from the outside. Inside, however, something fundamental had shifted. And as Evelyn turned onto the main road and drove the 42 miles back toward the shoreline, she understood that she would never again accept the title chosen for her by someone else. The highway stretched ahead in long, quiet lines of white and yellow, the kind that guided without demanding attention. Evelyn drove with both hands steady on the steering wheel, the radio off, the rhythm of the tires against asphalt forming a low, constant hum. Traffic was light at this hour. Most families were still seated around living room televisions, finishing leftovers and retelling familiar stories. She had once believed that belonging required shrinking certain parts of herself. Tonight she understood that belonging built on distortion was only a performance. The shoreline exit sign appeared, illuminated in reflective green. She signaled and turned, passing darkened storefronts and closed diners that would reopen at 6 in the morning. Her condominium building stood quiet against the water, a modest 3-story structure with wide windows facing the sound. She parked in her usual space, the number painted neatly in white near the curb. Inside, the lobby lights cast a soft glow across polished tile floors. She greeted the night concierge with a calm smile and took the elevator up to the 3rd floor. When she stepped into her unit, the familiar scent of cedar and sea air welcomed her. The space was orderly, intentional, every piece of furniture chosen without negotiation. She set her keys on the console table and removed her coat, hanging it carefully in the closet. For a moment, she stood in the center of the living room, listening to the faint sound of waves beyond the glass. There was no echo of misplaced laughter here, no reframing of her accomplishments into something smaller. She walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, the simple action grounding her in the present. Her phone vibrated again, this time with a message from one of the younger guests who had asked for career advice. The message thanked her for speaking honestly and asked if she might be willing to recommend reading materials or offer guidance in the future. Evelyn read the words slowly. Influence, she knew, was not measured by applause but by the quiet decisions others made after hearing you speak. She placed the phone on the counter and moved toward the balcony doors. Outside, the sound reflected the moonlight in broken silver lines. She stepped onto the balcony and rested her hands on the cool metal railing. The air was crisp, perhaps 45 degrees, carrying the steady scent of salt. She thought about the dining room earlier that evening, about how easily a false title had once defined her in that space. She thought about how calmly truth had replaced it. She did not feel anger toward her parents. She felt distance. A healthy, necessary distance built not from resentment, but from clarity. For the first time in years, the story of who she was did not depend on their acknowledgment. It depended on her own refusal to edit it. And as she stood there overlooking the dark water, she understood that some corrections do not require confrontation. They require consistency, the kind she had practiced her entire life. The next morning arrived with a pale gray horizon stretching across the water, the kind of quiet dawn that did not demand attention but rewarded those who noticed it. Evelyn woke without an alarm, her mind clear in a way that felt unfamiliar after family gatherings in years past. She moved through her routine with deliberate calm, brewing coffee, reviewing market updates on her tablet, scanning overnight reports from the West Coast Division. Numbers did not distort themselves to protect feelings. They revealed patterns honestly. As sunlight filtered through the wide balcony windows, her phone rang. The caller identification displayed Thomas Harper. She let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded measured, not defensive, not quite apologetic. He commented that the evening had been unexpected, that Daniel Brooks was an impressive man. Evelyn listened without interrupting. She could hear the careful phrasing, the attempt to recalibrate without admitting error. Thomas mentioned that he had not realized the full extent of her responsibilities, that perhaps he had underestimated how much she managed. The word underestimated lingered between them. Evelyn replied that she had never hidden her work, only simplified it when speaking at the table. Silence followed, softer than before. Thomas cleared his throat and said that some of the guests had asked about investment opportunities, that perhaps there might be room for collaboration in the future. Evelyn recognized the shift immediately. Recognition had opened a door that respect alone had never unlocked. She did not respond with resentment. She responded with precision. She explained that professional opportunities were evaluated based on alignment and merit, not proximity or familiarity. Her tone remained steady. On the other end of the line, she could hear him adjusting to the new framework. He asked if she would be joining them for Christmas. The question was simple, but its weight carried history. For decades, she had attended out of obligation, accepting the familiar introductions, the softened titles. This time she did not answer immediately. She looked out at the water where a small fishing boat traced a thin line across the surface, steady and self-directed. She said she would consider her schedule and confirm closer to the date. It was not rejection. It was autonomy. When the call ended, she set the phone down and returned to her reports. A message notification appeared from Daniel, forwarding a news article highlighting the company's recent expansion into underserved counties. He wrote that leadership was most visible when it was least announced. Evelyn allowed herself a small, private smile. The previous evening had not been about correcting her parents publicly. It had been about refusing to participate in a narrative that diminished her. She closed the article and opened her calendar for the upcoming week. Meetings, projections, strategic planning sessions filled the screen. Her life did not hinge on a dining room introduction. It never had. And as the morning sun rose higher above the sound, casting light across her organized desk, she understood that the real title she carried required no permission, no defense, and no correction ever again. Monday arrived with a sharp Atlantic wind cutting across the shoreline, rattling the balcony glass just enough to remind Evelyn that seasons did not ask permission before changing. She arrived at the Brooks Medical Systems headquarters in Stamford at 8:15 in the morning, the lobby already humming with quiet efficiency. The marble floors reflected the overhead lights in clean lines, and the security desk attendant greeted her by name without hesitation. No one here required clarification. In the executive conference room on the 12th floor, a wall of windows overlooked the harbor where tugboats moved with deliberate patience. The quarterly strategy meeting began at 8:30 sharp. Directors reviewed projections, risk assessments, expansion timelines. Evelyn listened more than she spoke, annotating figures in the margins of printed reports, her pen moving with calm precision. When she did speak, her comments were measured, addressing long-term sustainability rather than short-term optics. She outlined a 5-year capital allocation plan that balanced growth with stability, ensuring that community clinic investments remain protected even if market volatility increased. The board members nodded, some taking notes, others simply absorbing the clarity of her approach. Daniel Brooks, seated at the head of the table, thanked her for anticipating supply fluctuations months before competitors reacted. The acknowledgment was brief and professional. It required no applause. After the meeting, Evelyn returned to her office where floor-to-ceiling windows framed the gray winter water below. A framed photograph rested on her desk, not of family gatherings, but of the first rural clinic opening ceremony 2 years earlier. A ribbon stretched across a modest brick entrance in a town with fewer than 12,000 residents. She had stood in the back that day, not at the microphone, observing the effect of quiet decisions made years prior. Her phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for a one-on-one call with the Midwest operations director. She connected promptly, discussing staffing projections and patient intake growth, asking questions that signaled both oversight and trust. Between conversations, a message notification appeared from Linda. It was short and carefully worded, mentioning that the Boston guests had spoken highly of her accomplishments and that perhaps they had not fully understood before. Evelyn read the message without immediate response. Understanding did not retroactively correct years of reduction. It simply marked a turning point. She set the phone face down on her desk and returned to her work. Outside, clouds gathered over the harbor, shifting light across the water in muted tones. Inside, the office remained steady, organized, intentional. The events of Thanksgiving no longer felt like a confrontation. They felt like a recalibration. She did not need to defend her title here. She carried it in every decision she made, in every projection she approved, in every community she chose to invest in. And as the afternoon light faded against the glass, Evelyn recognized that respect rooted in competence could not be revoked by a single introduction, no matter how carelessly it had once been delivered. By Thursday afternoon, the market shifted unexpectedly, a ripple across global indices that sent several companies into cautious recalculation. Inside the executive floor at Brooks Medical Systems, the atmosphere remained controlled. Analysts moved quietly between offices carrying updated projections, screens filled with charts reflecting new variables. Evelyn stood at the window of her office, reviewing the latest data summary while the harbor below darkened under a gathering line of clouds. Volatility did not intimidate her. It clarified priorities. She called an immediate strategy session with the finance and operations teams, not to react impulsively, but to confirm that their 5-year stability model could absorb short-term disruption. Around the conference table, department heads presented revised forecasts, each one waiting for her assessment. Evelyn listened, pen resting lightly against the margin of her notepad. When she spoke, her voice remained steady. She adjusted capital deployment by a fraction, delayed a non-essential infrastructure upgrade, and reaffirmed funding for rural clinics without hesitation. Stability, she reminded them, was not about avoiding change. It was about anticipating it before it arrived. The room relaxed slightly, not because the risk disappeared, but because direction had been restored. After the meeting, Daniel entered her office with a folder under his arm. He commented that her composure during external pressure was precisely why he valued her partnership. Evelyn responded with a brief nod. Leadership did not require dramatics. It required consistency. Her phone vibrated on the desk. Another message from Linda appeared, this time longer, mentioning that Thomas had been speaking about her achievements to a neighbor and that perhaps the family had not expressed enough pride over the years. The wording was careful, almost rehearsed. Evelyn read the message twice before placing the phone face down once more. Pride spoken after public validation felt different from pride offered privately, without audience. She did not resent the message. She categorized it. That evening, as she prepared to leave the office, she reviewed the updated projections one final time, confirming that reserves remained strong and that employee benefits would not be touched despite the broader market tension. Outside, wind swept across the parking structure, tugging at her coat as she walked toward her car. She thought about the dining table from the previous week, about how easily narratives could shift when external authority intervened. In the boardroom, authority was measured in results. In her parents' house, it had once been measured in hierarchy. She unlocked her car and sat behind the wheel, allowing a brief moment of stillness before starting the engine. She did not need her parents to understand the mechanics of global finance. She only needed them to recognize that her life was built on more than assistance and politeness. As she drove toward the shoreline, city lights reflecting off wet pavement, she understood that respect gained through performance could disappear. Respect grounded in competence endured. And in both boardroom and dining room, she had chosen the same strategy. Say less. Stand firm. Let the facts hold their own weight. The following week unfolded with disciplined momentum, each day structured by meetings, forecasts, and strategic reviews that required precision rather than emotion. Evelyn noticed that something subtle had changed in the way colleagues interacted with her. There had always been respect, but now there was a deeper attentiveness, as though the steadiness she displayed under pressure had traveled beyond the boardroom walls. On Wednesday afternoon, a regional director from Ohio requested a direct consultation regarding a new clinic site in a county with fewer than 18,000 residents. Evelyn reviewed demographic data, transportation access, and projected patient volume before offering guidance that balanced expansion with sustainability. Her questions were thoughtful, focused not only on profitability but on measurable impact. When the call ended, she documented follow-up steps with methodical clarity. Later that evening, as she sat at her dining table overlooking the dark water, her phone rang again. This time it was Linda, her voice softer than before, stripped of the performative brightness that once colored family conversations. She spoke about the quiet house after Thanksgiving, about how Thomas had spent hours rereading an article about Brooks Medical Systems that one of the guests had forwarded. She admitted that perhaps they had not understood how much Evelyn carried alone. The words arrived slowly, without defense. Evelyn listened without interrupting, recognizing that acknowledgment did not need embellishment. Linda asked whether she would consider visiting the following weekend, not for a gathering, but simply for coffee. No introductions. No guests, just conversation. Evelyn paused before answering. She understood the difference between apologies spoken to restore image and reflection spoken to restore relationship. She agreed to consider it and said she would confirm after reviewing her schedule. When the call ended, she remained seated for several minutes, hands resting calmly on the table. Outside, the sound moved in steady rhythm against the shoreline. She thought about the distance she had built over years, not out of resentment, but out of necessity. Distance had allowed her to grow without constant correction. Now the possibility of recalibration felt less like obligation and more like choice. The following morning at the office, Daniel stopped by her workspace with updated market analysis. He remarked that clarity had a way of surfacing truth in every environment, whether corporate or personal. Evelyn offered a faint smile. She had not set out to confront anyone at Thanksgiving. She had simply refused to participate in a narrative that diminished her. The rest had followed naturally. As she reviewed the latest projections, confirming that reserves remained strong despite continued volatility, she realized that the same discipline guiding her professional life applied equally to her family. Stability required boundaries. Respect required accuracy. And correction, when necessary, could be delivered without raising a voice. It could arrive quietly, sustained by consistency rather than conflict. For the first time in many years, she felt that the story unfolding between her and her parents was not predetermined by old habits. It was being rewritten carefully, line by line, with the same deliberate precision she applied to every decision that shaped the future of her company. Saturday arrived with a quiet, silver sky stretching over the Connecticut suburbs, the kind of muted morning that softened edges without erasing them. Evelyn drove the familiar 42 miles inland with measured calm, her hands steady on the steering wheel, her mind clear. The trees lining the residential streets had surrendered most of their leaves, branches exposed against the pale horizon. When she pulled into the driveway of her childhood home, the house looked unchanged from the outside, its white siding clean, the front porch decorated with a simple wreath that hinted at the approaching Christmas season. She stepped out of the car and paused briefly, not out of hesitation but out of awareness. Entering this space had once meant adjusting herself before crossing the threshold. Today she carried no adjustment. Linda opened the door before Evelyn reached it, offering a small, restrained smile. There was no audience this time, no polished introductions, no background laughter. Inside, the house felt quieter than usual, the ticking of the wall clock more noticeable, without conversation layered over it. Thomas stood in the living room holding 2 coffee mugs, his posture less rigid than she remembered from Thanksgiving. He handed one to Evelyn and gestured toward the sofa. They sat across from one another, the space between them no longer crowded by guests or performance. Thomas spoke first. He admitted that he had replayed the evening in his mind several times, and that the way he introduced her had not reflected the truth of who she was. The words were simple, without dramatic flourish. Linda added that they had grown accustomed to speaking of Evelyn in ways that kept family hierarchy intact, not realizing how those small reductions accumulated over time. Evelyn listened without interruption, her expression composed. She did not rush to absolve them. She allowed the acknowledgment to stand on its own. When she spoke, her voice carried neither accusation nor softness, only clarity. She explained that she had spent decades simplifying herself at their table because it seemed easier than correcting them, but that she no longer intended to participate in that pattern. Respect, she said, did not require celebration. It required accuracy. The room remained still after she finished, the only sound the faint hum of the heating system. Thomas nodded slowly, as though adjusting to a new frame of reference. Linda reached for Evelyn's hand, not dramatically, but gently, and said they were proud of her, not because others had validated her title, but because they were beginning to understand the discipline and resilience behind it. Evelyn felt the words settled differently this time, not as repair, but as recognition. She did not embrace them immediately. She did not withdraw either. She sat there, steady and present, aware that relationships recalibrated the same way markets did, gradually, through consistent correction. When she finally rose to leave, there were no exaggerated promises about the future, only a quiet agreement to meet again before Christmas. As she stepped back onto the porch and felt the cool air against her face, she understood that her real title had never depended on introduction. It had depended on her refusal to let others define it for her. And now, at last, that refusal had become visible, even within the walls that once reduced her. December settled in with a quiet discipline that matched Evelyn's own. Frost traced thin white lines along the edges of her balcony railing each morning, and the sound reflected a pale winter sun that never quite reached full warmth. At the office, year-end reviews filled her calendar. Performance summaries, budget forecasts for the coming fiscal year, strategic expansion proposals that required both optimism and restraint. She moved through each meeting with the same measured clarity that had defined her career, neither rushing praise nor withholding critique. Consistency, she believed, was a form of respect. Midweek, an internal newsletter circulated through the company highlighting executive leadership contributions over the past 12 months. Evelyn's name appeared alongside a concise summary of the Rural Health Expansion Initiative and the financial stabilization model that had protected employee benefits during market volatility. The acknowledgment was factual, without embellishment. She read it once, then closed the email. Validation within her professional sphere had always been grounded in evidence. That was why it endured. Later that evening, as she reviewed quarterly figures at her dining table overlooking the dark water, her phone vibrated with a group message from extended family members. A cousin shared a link to an industry article featuring Brooks Medical Systems, adding a brief note of congratulations directed toward Evelyn. The tone was respectful, almost careful. Thomas responded in the thread before she could, writing that his daughter had worked tirelessly to build something meaningful and that the family was proud. The words were public now, visible beyond the walls of a dining room. Evelyn observed the exchange without immediate reply. Pride expressed in writing carried a permanence that spoken introductions never had. She set the phone aside and returned to her figures, ensuring next year's operating margin would allow for 2 additional clinic sites in counties where medical access remained limited. The following morning, Linda called to ask whether Evelyn would be comfortable attending a small Christmas brunch at the house, limited to immediate family only. No guests, no exaggerated stories, just conversation. Evelyn listened to the proposal as she stood in her office, the harbor visible through the glass behind her. She asked a single question. Would introductions, if any were necessary, reflect accuracy? Linda paused briefly before answering yes. That was all Evelyn required. On Friday afternoon, as employees gathered in the lobby for a modest holiday reception, Daniel approached her with a simple remark. Influence, he said, often extended further than its origin intended. Evelyn understood. Thanksgiving had not been about confrontation. It had been about alignment. And now, weeks later, she could see the subtle but measurable shifts in every environment she occupied. In her parents' home, language was becoming more precise. In her company, leadership remained steady. The two spheres no longer contradicted one another. As she returned to her office to finalize the last report of the year, she felt neither vindicated nor triumphant. She felt consistent. The title she carried had not changed. What had changed was the willingness of others to say it correctly. Christmas morning arrived with a pale blue sky stretching over the quiet neighborhood, thin frost outlining rooftops and mailbox edges in delicate white. Evelyn parked in the driveway just before 10, the same driveway she had pulled into countless times over the decades, though it no longer carried the same unspoken expectations. She stepped out of her car with steady composure, her coat buttoned neatly against the cold. Inside the house, the scent of fresh coffee and pine filled the air. A modest tree stood near the living room window, its lights soft rather than extravagant. There were no extra chairs arranged for guests, no polished performance awaiting an audience. Thomas opened the door this time, without hesitation, and greeted her by name, full and unshortened. The sound carried quiet intention. Linda followed with a gentle smile and led her toward the dining room, where a simple brunch had been prepared. No elaborate introductions were required. No titles were adjusted. They sat together at the smaller breakfast table near the kitchen window, sunlight reflecting faintly off the glass. Conversation began cautiously, as though each word was being measured before spoken. Thomas asked about the coming fiscal year and the expansion into New England counties. His tone was curious rather than skeptical. Evelyn explained the projected timeline, the staffing models, the way demographic data informed site selection. She noticed that he listened fully, not waiting to redirect the subject. Linda asked about the rural clinics, about how many families had benefited from reduced travel times. Evelyn described a town where residents once drove nearly 90 miles for routine care and now had access within 10. She spoke plainly, without embellishment. Respect, she had learned, was sustained through repetition of truth. After brunch, they moved to the living room, where wrapped gifts sat beneath the tree. There was no theatrical exchange, only small packages handed over with understated warmth. One gift from her parents contained a leather-bound planner embossed with her initials. Inside the cover, a handwritten note acknowledged her leadership and the discipline it required. The message was not lengthy. It was specific. Evelyn read it once, and then closed the cover carefully. She did not dramatize her response. She thanked them, meeting their eyes steadily. Later, as she prepared to leave, Thomas walked her to the door. He did not overstate regret or offer grand declarations. Instead, he said he hoped they would continue speaking honestly, even when it felt uncomfortable. Evelyn agreed. Accuracy, she replied, was rarely uncomfortable once accepted. Outside, winter sunlight reflected off the quiet street as she stepped onto the porch. The air felt crisp, but not sharp. As she drove back toward the shoreline, she understood that change had not arrived in a single moment of correction. It had unfolded gradually, reinforced by consistency. In the boardroom, she had always insisted on clear language. In her parents' home, she had finally done the same. And as the sound came into view once more, steady and expansive beneath the winter sky, she recognized that the most lasting adjustments were not loud. They were precise. January arrived with a sharper edge, the kind of cold that pressed against windows and reminded even coastal towns that winter was fully in control. Evelyn returned to her routine with renewed focus, the holiday conversations settling into memory without lingering tension. At the office, the new fiscal year planning sessions intensified. Projections were refined, risk models stress-tested, long-term capital allocations reviewed line by line. In the executive conference room, she outlined a 5-year community expansion strategy that would bring 3 additional clinics to underserved counties, each located in areas where residents previously traveled over 60 miles for routine medical care. The board members listened with attentiveness that did not feel ceremonial. It felt earned. After the meeting, Daniel remained behind and remarked that steady leadership during transition years defined an organization's future. Evelyn acknowledged the comment without dramatics. She had never measured her worth by external praise, but she recognized its role in shaping institutional confidence. That afternoon, a package arrived at her office from a rural clinic in the Midwest. Inside was a handwritten letter from a nurse practitioner describing how patient wait times had decreased by nearly 40% since the expansion. The note included a small photograph of the clinic's entrance, snow gathered along the sidewalk, a modest sign bearing the company name. Evelyn placed the photograph on her desk beside the earlier ribbon-cutting image. The impact of her work was not theoretical. It was tangible. Later that evening, as she prepared a simple dinner in her condominium kitchen, her phone rang. Thomas called, not with correction or justification, but with a question about retirement planning. He asked how to structure long-term investments more responsibly, acknowledging that she understood the mechanics better than he did. Evelyn listened carefully before offering practical guidance about diversification and sustainable withdrawals. There was no trace of condescension in her tone, only clarity. When the call ended, she realized that something fundamental had shifted. Advice once dismissed was now requested. Expertise once minimized was now respected. She stepped onto her balcony after dinner, the sound reflecting city lights in scattered fragments. The wind was cold, nearly 35 degrees, but steady. She thought about how narratives solidified over time if never challenged. She had not dismantled hers through confrontation. She had corrected it through consistency. At home, her parents were learning to speak her name with full recognition. At work, her colleagues continued to rely on her precision. The two worlds no longer felt divided. As she stood there overlooking the winter water, she understood that titles carried weight only when backed by substance. And substance, once established, did not disappear simply because someone chose a lesser word. It endured quietly, visible in decisions, measurable in outcomes, and undeniable to those willing to see it clearly.